Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to get started here tonight. My name is Bill Myers, and I'm with the Air National Guard. I'm the Environmental Program Manager for the Truax PFAS Remedial investigation. And I want to introduce the folks that are on the panel tonight. There's Ms. Kim Jones from the county, Dan Stotts from the Air National Guard, Lieutenant Colonel Stotts, Paul, DiCaprio, and John Riddling from EA. They're with our contracts, working on the remedial investigation. So they're up here, so if there's questions that I can't answer, they can help answer. We'll, share in between us, trying to answer the questions if it's something that I can't answer. So tonight, there's two presentations that we're going to do. The first one's going to be on relative risk site evaluation. It's something that we do internally in the Air Force, where we use it to sequence and prioritize funding for these PFAS investigations and cleanup. We have to go out for a 30-day public comment period, and I'll give you more details on that when I give the overview of the RRSC process. And then once we get done with that presentation, we'll probably take 10-15 minutes to do question and answer with that. And then after that, we'll start into the overview of the remedial investigation, where we're at, where we're going, and what we've done to date out here. So there's two pieces of that. At the end of each presentation, we'll give a chance for some questions and answers. And at the end, if we got to go over a little bit to do some more questions and answers, we'll do that. But then at the end of the evening, we'll retire back out to the poster boards, and we can talk one-on-one with y'all on your individual questions that you have in that. So just a little bit of background about myself. I actually started my environmental career in Milwaukee back in 1992. So I've been doing cleanup for 24 plus years. I'm a licensed Wisconsin professional geologist, and I've done a lot of the cleanups in the Air Guard as well as the Army National Guard. So I've got a lot of commercial government cleanup experience. So just kind of give you kind of a heads up. And I actually lived in Milwaukee probably for 9 years. So I lived in the great state of Wisconsin. So with that, I'm going to start out with the relative risk site evaluation. So here's my contact information. Also, we've got the 115th Public Affairs email up there. If you have other questions that's not related to the presentation that you want to bring up, or related to it, either or. And I've already talked about this. I kind of got ahead of myself. So RRSE, Relative Risk Site Evaluation. So this is an internal tool that the Air Force uses for its PFAS portfolio that they use to rank, prioritize, and sequence funding, because we can't pay for everything all at once. So basically the Air Force goes out, looks at the information that we collected from the site inspection on soil and groundwater contamination, plugs that information in, and we'll go into all the details of how we do that. But it comes up with a relative risk, and the Air Force likes to focus on doing the worst first. So with this RRSC, that's how they do that. So we are one of in the Air Force portfolio, there's Air Force Reserve, Air National Guard, and then there's active duty Air Force. And out of all those installations, and they'll take RRSCs for each one of those, and they'll prioritize and sequence the funding for the PFAS investigation and cleanups. Okay, on to the next slide. So I've already kind of touched on this, and all the services do it as well. So it's not just Air Force, it's Army, Navy, they all have to go through this process, and it's done nationwide. So here's some benefits of the relative risk site evaluation. Some of these things I already kind of talked about. Providing a framework that's a common approach for DoD organizations to categorize and sequence, the high-risk sites so they can prioritize how they use the funding. Second one talks about, most urgent sites so that resources can be focused on the higher relative risk, so worst first. Third bullet here talks about the rating kind of serves as a basis for discussion with stakeholders within the DoD community as well as the public. And then periodic ratings and updates. So typically, and you'll see a slide, I have a slide on here that talks about the CERCLA process, the cleanup process, and how many years that it takes. But typically, once we do the site inspection, where we find site inspection is basically a yes, no, there's contamination present, there's not. They typically do the relative risk site evaluation after they do the site inspection. But good news for us is we're already on contract to do the remedial investigation before we even had to do the relative risk site evaluation. Does that mean that we don't have to do it? No, we still have to do it because they use the RRSE and we update it periodically because then it'll be used to prioritize other efforts like cleanup and downstream things that we got to do to get the site closed out. So it's basically once we get it done, we'll update it because when we do the remedial investigation, we're going to get new data, new information, and the risk could potentially change. It could go up, it could go down. But that's why we do it during the remedial investigation part of it, because that's where we're collecting the data to tell us, what human health risks are out there and how much is it and what we should do, as far as a cleanup decision. So that's what the RI helps us, develop. Next slide. What the RRSE is not. It's not a substitute for a baseline risk assessment. This is just an initial snapshot using the analytical data that we collected during the site inspection to help us kind of look at the data and come up with some relative risk numbers to prioritize and categorize the risk. It's also not a way to halt site progress. So we already went to the RI phase, funded a contract, and we're doing the RRSE right now, so that's proof of that. So it's not something going, oh, you can't move forward because you don't have your RRSE done. So if it's a high enough priority, in the Air Guard, we made the decision to fund the remedial investigation for Truax ahead of a lot of other bases in the nation. So, but the RRSE is not a tool to stop progress. And it's also not a tool to justify particular actions or lack of. RRSE. So DoD has been identifying all the potential sites affected by PFAS out there. The Air National Guard has about 75 air bases or Air National Guard bases across the country where we're looking at them for whether there's PFAS present or not. And this map down here in the bottom, let's see if this laser window works, kind of shows in the little red triangles where all the wrong one, darn. There we go. So all these triangles represent Air National Guard bases across the country. Guam, Alaska. All right. So we're following the CERCLA process. The Air Guard and the Air Force are making progress towards cleanup of PFAS sites. 73 installations have been completed so far out of the 75 where we've done the site inspections and we've identified that there's potential contamination there. Next slide. So here's the CERCLA process. Talked about, so just to kind of give you an overview of it, and we've got a few other slides that'll give time durations for these. But normally, you get the site designated. We identified, that there was PFAS at a site or an installation. They do a preliminary assessment, which we've already done, and we've done the site inspection. Right now, we can put a green check box on the remedial investigation. It's not done, but we're starting it. So probably about a year ago, 30 September, we awarded a contract to EA to start that remedial investigation. So that's where we're kind of at, but this kind of shows the progression. After we get done with the remedial investigation, we'll move on to the feasibility study, which will look at alternatives, cost estimates to how we would address contamination that's a human health risk. And then we'd go to proposed plan, record of decision, which basically goes out for public comment again. Both these documents do, proposed plan and record of decision, that talks about how the decisions that we're proposing to make. We're going to address soil contamination using this technology, doing X. We're going to address groundwater contamination using this technology. So it actually all goes out for public comment again, because the public's involved as part of this decision process. But the RI really drives all those decisions, the data that we collect, and with nature and extent. And then once we do the record of decision, if there's a remedial design required, we'll do it. Or if we just go right into remedial action, and then we complete the project. So that's just kind of a general overview of the circle process. So here's that timeline I was talking about. So typically, site identification, the PASI, can take anywhere from 1 to 3 years to happen. That was already done. We had a contractor out here. They did the preliminary assessment and the site inspection. Now we're at the remedial investigation. So we're getting ready to start on that adventure. And what else? So now we're doing the RRSE for that. So relative risk, at Air National Guard sites, we're basically at the start of the RI. Go on to the next slide. So here's the relative risk process for you all. We identify the sites at the installations, which we've already done. We're assembling the data, so we collected the information, sources, pathways, receptors. Those are all the things that we look at as part of the relative risk site evaluation. We'll go into more detail. And then the evaluation factors that we use, contaminant hazard factor, there's a migration pathway factor, and there's a human receptor factor. And all that generates whether it's high risk, medium, or low. And we'll go into that detailed process here on the next slides. So, RRSE summary for Truax. PRL is potential release location. These are the potential release locations that we categorized as high. We don't have any medium, we don't have any low sites. Here's a depiction of what we look at, kind of a cross-sectional cartoon view of soil, groundwater, how precipitation interacts. And some of this we'll use as part of our conceptual site model to help us with this, but kind of just wanted to show you for the media that we looked at for this RRSE, for groundwater and surface soil, using those 3 factors. So this is just kind of a general cross-sectional overview to kind of give you an idea of how precipitation, rain, infiltrates into the ground, gets into the groundwater, and if there's surface water by, that may, if there's contamination in it, may get to the surface water body. Just a general overview. So 3 evaluation factors, I already talked about this, the contaminant hazard factor, migration pathway factor, and receptor factor. And these are what we use to determine and evaluate, observed contamination, magnitude, source pathways, and receptor relationships. Basically, that conceptual site model helps us determine those. So here's an example of a groundwater worksheet. And at the top, you can see the max concentrations that they've got. We got this information from the RIs. And then a comparison value, those are the screening limits that we used. And then we come up with a ratio. And then from that, we get a rating. And down here is just an explanation of migration pathway and receptor pathway. So the top box is a contaminant hazard factor. This one's the migration pathway factor. And we'll go over each one of these, how we come up with that. And then the receptor pathway. But we do two of these sheets, these worksheets. One's for soil, surface soil, and one's for groundwater. And this is nationwide. It doesn't matter if you're at Polk Field or if you're at Nellis Air Force Base. Everywhere we use these same, the Air Force uses these same two worksheets. So relative risk, okay. So here's this contamination hazard factor. Put my glasses on, the screen's a little fuzzy. So with the contamination hazard factor, there's three ratings. There's minimum, where the contamination hazard factor is less than 2. There's moderate, or medium, where it's anywhere from 2 to 100, and significant, where it's greater than 100. And they use those max concentrations. They use PFAS, PFOA, and PFAS. They put it in the max concentrations, and they get a ratio with that. So if you see on the bottom, they took those concentrations, and they did a comparison factor, and then they came up with the ratio. And this is the score of the ratio. So it says 996. So that's greater than 100, so that got a rating of a high. Migration pathway is also determined by designating the site either as evident, potential, or confined. So for evident, contamination is at a point of exposure that can actually impact a groundwater well or a drinking water well. Potential is the exposure to contamination may happen, and confined is low possibility. And then they list out down here evident, potential, those same definitions. I won't read them for you because they're up there. But then they come up with a factor based upon that information. So for Truax, they came up with a medium. Well, and then the next one is the receptor factor, which is determined by evaluating a receptor has a potential to contact contaminated media. So identify when receptors are in contact, when receptors may come into contact, or limited when there's little or no contact. So for Truax, this was identified as high. So we had identified it. And the next slide is going to show how they take those three factors and then they determine the overall risk. So up here is an example of that, where they got the contamination factor on the top row. On the side is the MPF, and then the receptor factors down on the bottom. Okay, and then this is another example of the groundwater worksheet. At the top it says, select chart 1, 2, or 3 based upon the contaminant hazard factor. So it was high, so we selected high. Second, they went into the migration factor and the receptor factor, and both of those were medium on the bottom. So the square is the media relative risk. Here's a high-risk example, cartoon again, cross-sectional view showing a landfill, leaching contamination to the groundwater table. There's a plume. It goes to a monitoring well, and then it just shows like a residential well down gradient. So if it's in the monitoring well, we know that it's there, but there's potential for it to hit a drinking water source. And that's basically how we do the RRSE. It's those three factors. We use the site inspection data. We evaluate them whether they're high, medium, or low. We take all three of those, and then we get a combined overall risk for the RRSE. So here's a web link for y'all. If you want to learn more about the relative risk site evaluation, there's a primer that's available. We've been doing this since 1997, DoD has, so this isn't something that's new. What's new is the emerging contaminant, PFAS and PFOA. Also on here, we already talked a little bit about this. You know, the goal of the RRSE framework is to include the regulators and the public stakeholders at public meetings. So we're doing an open house, kind of giving an overview of the RRSE process, and we're also giving an overview of the remedial investigation that we have going on here. And the other part of that is communicating openly with stakeholders to give them an opportunity to confirm information and work. So you all have an opportunity through this 30-day public comment period to provide comments on this RRSE. And we'll go to questions. So I'm going to open the floor up to questions. I know that was a lot of technical, tried to keep it down. So any questions out there? Okay.
Are any of those slides or facsimile thereof available online? Sort of hard to copy all that.
Yeah, I think we can make them copy. Go ahead.
Hi, to answer your question, yes. So a recording of this event, as well as the slides and information on how to submit comments, will be available on the Wisconsin National Guard PFAS information page. I can read off the link to you if you'd like, or if you want to touch base with me after, I can give you the specific link.
Why don't you tell everybody?
Sure. So the website, just make sure I'm going to get it out so I can do the right, so I don't try to memorize it. So the link is https:///N as in Nancy, G as in golf, .wi.v as in golf, O, V as in Victor, /PFAS, PFAS. So all that information will be available tomorrow morning on that link.
Okay. Any other questions? Oh, all right. I'll get to you in a second. Go ahead. Down on the lower left here.
Oh,
Sorry.
so in those first two slides, and a question you had, I think it was the first two.
Okay, go back.
It was what it was not, right?
Yep.
Okay, just clarifying the last one. It's not a tool for justifying a particular action or lack thereof.
Yep.
So my next question is anywhere in this process, either the investigation or this, which is, or the remedial action plan that you might come up with,
Yeah.
would any of those things have any potential impact on either delaying or halting the bed down in the F-35?
Not that I'm aware of, but I'm not here to talk about F-35 bed down decisions.
See, that's no question.
Yeah. No, it doesn't have any impact. We still got to do the investigation.
Thank you.
So it's like, if it was a petroleum release, we'd do the same thing. So, okay, over here in the second row.
Yeah, so what steps is the Air National Guard taking to achieve the proposed Wisconsin DNR groundwater standards of 20 parts per trillion, PFOS plus PFOA, and what's the timeline for those steps? So in other words, when are you going to clean this stuff up?
Oh, we're working on doing our remedial investigation is the first part. Well, the third part of that, we already did the PASI. So we're collecting the data, and this next presentation I'll go into a little better detail on how we're going to delineate soil, groundwater, surface water, sediment, contamination related to it in the conceptual site model. That information that we collect from the remedial investigation will drive the evaluation of potential technologies, the feasibility study piece, and the proposed plan. So what's above, the standards that we have there. With respect to the DNR standards, and I know the DNR's here, I'll give my 2 bits of that, and I'll let the DNR speak to that. But right now, they're in the process of promulgating the groundwater standards for those. Those haven't been promulgated yet. So as part of the remedial investigation, we typically look at, they call them RRs, applicable requirements, and state regulations are applicable requirements, but until they actually become promulgated, we can't speculate on what a standard could be. It has to go through that whole process and be a promulgated rule as part of the, through Wisconsin. So it'd have to go through that whole promulgation process. Not saying that we're not going to consider them, but typically we do that during the RI and the feasibility study. We'll look at the RRs. So if the state has a standard when we go through that, that'll be considered as part of the RR. So Steve Alice, are you here? Yeah, if you want to add.
Yeah, with respect to NR140, NR140 is our groundwater quality standard, and the DNR is in the process of working through that promulgation process. So the last time I talked to people about how it was proceeding, that's being spearheaded by our drinking water program, I think it will be at least the end of 22, if not 2030, 23, before PFOA and PFOS get into an actual promulgated standard in the state.
Yes, ma'am.
My concern is there doesn't seem to be any sense of urgency here, and that this process is going to take 3, 5, 7, 13 years. And the construction at Truax for the F-35s is going to disperse the PFAS through Starkweather Creek into the lakes, which has already started. One well is already contaminated. And so you're going to discover that the PFAS are probably gone because they were already dispersed into the lakes. And will you be cleaning up the lakes then and the wells after they get contaminated because you've been dawdling on this?
Okay. So with respect to, Truax's remedial investigations that we're doing nationwide, Truax is one of the first 12 that we've done. I believe we got it on contract. It's been on contract for a year. There's some, and I'll talk about this in the RI process. We've been working on work plans. We've been working with the DNR. We put together our project management plan that's got a schedule. We're actually going to go out and we're going to look at those, the conceptual site model to look at where our data gaps are. Because like I said, the SI was a confirmation, yes, it's there, no, it's not. So yes, it's there. So now we got to go out and characterize that. And we're working with the DNR to identify that, what that conceptual site model is. So when we do our investigation, we focus that on filling those data gaps and getting those answers. Is the contamination going to go away because it's washed away? No, it doesn't. It's not going to, that doesn't happen like that. It takes time. It takes time, and we're doing the investigation, and we're going to get those answers so we just can't jump to cleanup without getting the answers, because then we might not be using our resources appropriately. If we just jump to a remediation and start, okay, let's start doing pump and treat, or we're going to do something. We don't even know the lateral and vertical extent, how far it's went in the groundwater, how deep is it in the soil. And we know it's present, but that's what the RI is going to do. It's designed to get those answers for us, to see how far it's went away, how does it interact with the surface water. So if there's the Starkweather Creek, is it from the Air National Guard that's causing that problem in the creek, or is it another source? We're not the only source in town out there with respect to this contamination. So we're going to look at all that. What's upgrading from us? What's downgrading it? What does our source look like on site as far as concentration levels in the soil and how it's leaching to the groundwater? Where does the groundwater plume go? How far does it go? All those things we have to answer in this remedial investigation. Now, and I hear this at all the sites. I have New York, I have Wisconsin, I have Pennsylvania, I have Massachusetts as my sites, and I do presentations like this, and everyone, you're not moving quick enough. Well, we're trying to, and we're doing our best, and we're trying to keep the public informed about what we're doing. By doing an event like this helps let you know what we're doing. And so, having that on contract, when was the SI completed? I think that was 2019? 2018? So it took 3 years, and at the time, we got limited amount of money. We actually used operation and maintenance funds to pay for the remedial investigation, which is a totally separate line of funding. I don't want to get into the color of money, but Air Force has another pot of money that's designated to cleaning this stuff up as well. So we went in advance of that to actually pay for this remedial investigation to be done. So if we were just sitting on our, we're not doing that. don't want to say trust me, but we are moving at a really quick pace to get this done. Out of 75 guard installation, or air guard plate installations, you're one of 12 here. So we're working towards that, and it's frustrating because it doesn't happen like overnight. We're working with the DNR, they've reviewed our plans, our work plans, and we're trying, to do the right thing, interacting with the stakeholders, because it's important, to have the DNR understand what we're trying to do and, have their acknowledgement, yeah, what you're doing is the right thing. So, does that answer your question, or?
No, but I know you're not going to.
Okay, thank you. Yes?
Following this process, what is the earliest date that cleanup could begin?
Ooh. Well, let me, can I hold that until I get into the RI slide, and I'll show you the time frames? That'll be, or I can actually just move to it. I'll just move to it real quick to show you. You get a preview early. So this is a timeline, and these are just typical timelines. So 2018, we completed the PASI. Years 3 through 6, if everything was funded and on time, our government was just in a continuing resolution where they were trying, the budget wasn't approved. There's a lot of factors that impact us getting the money that we need to do these types of activities. But, so for an RI, it typically takes it's done during years 3 through 6. So September 30th, 2020, we awarded the RI contract. We worked on a program management plan. There was a programmatic document that we put together that was fairly significant, and we worked with the DNR to review that. And then there was a site-specific quality assurance project plan that laid out how we were going to characterize these sites. So since 30 September, we've done a lot of stuff. Now we're getting ready to start the remedial investigation this spring. So we're going to go out and we're going to start collecting data. And we're going to work with the DNR to delineate the PFAS contamination, whether it's in soil, groundwater, or surface water, or sediment, or a combination. As far as the cleanup answer, typically once we get done with that, there's a feasibility study part of that, which hasn't been put under contract because we've still got to do the RI. But that'll be the next logical step, is to do the feasibility study. And then based upon what the feasibility study recommends, we'll select a proposed plan. Here's how we're going to address soil. Here's how we're going to address groundwater. Here's how we're going to address surface water. The sources that are contributing to those, so we can get rid of that source that's causing the contamination. But until we delineate lateral and vertical extent of that and have a better understanding of the data gaps that are in our conceptual site model, we won't be able to make good decisions about what we need to do and where we need to do it. So, does that answer your question? And then, well, as far as cleanup, so RD, remedial design and remedial action, that could take 2 to 4. So right now we're in the RI piece of this, so it's 2022. So this RI could take 1 to 2 years. It's an iterative process, and I'll go over that with y'all to let you know. But once we get that, and we write the report, and we work with the DNR, we'll do the feasibility study. And then that could take 1 to 2 years. Those typically don't take as long as the remedial investigations because we already have the data that we need to make those decisions, and then we'll go out for a proposed plan, which could take another 1 to 2 years. Hopefully on the lesser side. And a lot of this is dependent on funding, going back to the RRSC and how they prioritize and sequence funding for these activities. So I don't know if that doesn't give you a good answer, but that's the process that we have to work in. If we had all the money in the world, we'd have it done, in 2 years, but we don't.
Bill, if I could add to that a little bit. So that's what's happening through the remedial investigation process as the federal entity addressing this, any PFAS impacts at Dane County Regional Airport. There's also other initiatives that are happening at the installation through partners that we have with, there's three probable responsible parties, and we're working with those parties on other type of interim actions that are ongoing. One, working with Dane County Regional Airport with stormwater infrastructure to mitigate any further impacts of any PFAS that might be migrating off our properties. So that's something that we're partnered together working on outside of the RI federal process. We also have a very promising pilot study that we again partnered with Dane County Regional Airport on, and recently approved through the DNR, and also that started up about 3 weeks ago. That has some very promising results that we can elaborate on at the end of the RI presentation. So Bill is sharing with you of what National Guard Bureau is doing as a federal entity to address this, but we're certainly addressing this locally as a whole government approach, working with the county, working with the city as well, with a lot of communications as one of our partners. So we're working at the federal, the state, the county, the city level to address this, any type of impacts in this really national issue that's ongoing.
Okay. Back there. I'll go with the lady in the back row, and I'll hit you next. Okay.
Thank you so much. So I wondered if you could clarify, so you talked about 75 sites across the nation that have PFAS contamination. I'm wondering if you could put this project in with that as a backdrop and a little bit of context with those 75 other sites. How many are in the same process as us? How many are further along? And how many are behind us, perhaps waiting for funding? And then I know you mentioned the number 12, and I'm just wondering if you could explain what the number 12 is again, 12 sites with the funding.
Okay, yeah. So there's 12 Air National Guard bases that we have remedial investigations on contract for, out of the 75 bases that are out there. So and PFAS was an emerging contaminant, you started hearing about it back in 2016. A lot of people didn't know what it was, and as it evolved, we had to go, basically OSD, Office of Secretary of Defense, asked each of the components to go out and tell us how many of these sites do you think you have? And I think if you go down on the site level, I think there's almost like 200 some PFAS sites out of those 75 installations. So just because it says an installation, like Truax has 9 different sites within its footprint. So, but it's one installation.
Okay. Well, first, I have a couple questions on that. I'm sorry. How do you know, without doing the investigation, that there is PFAS?
That's the site inspection. So out of 73 of them, we've done the preliminary assessments and the site inspections. So when they go out, they'll go, like here at Truax, they went out and they did some soil sampling, some groundwater sampling, some surface water sampling, kind of like a yes, no, and they collected it for PFAS. And they came back, there was PFAS in the groundwater, and there was some in the soil. And so that's part of the CERCLA process, and even the DNR's process. You don't do anything until, is it present, is it not? So it's present.
And with the 200 sites, but that are 75, 200 installations that are 75 sites, did I get that right?
The other way around.
Okay.
200 sites and 75 installations.
Okay, and out of those, how many are perhaps behind us in the process? And if you have that chart.
Well, 200 sites, I guess if you look at it from the installation point of view, whatever 75 minus 12 is, if each of the Air Guard installations has some type of PFAS issue. So we're ahead of the curve.
Okay.
Truax is ahead.
And would you be able to list the 12 or the 11 other sites that are undergoing this process?
What's that?
Would you be able to list the 11 other sites?
I can give you some numbers just offhand on the one.
City or something like that.
Where are they at? So for me, I'm working in Pennsylvania. I've got one at Biddle. I've got it at Stewart. I've got it at Rrsc. Those are in New York. Schenectady, Hancock. Those are my states. So I know where my RIs are and bases are, but you know, nationwide, we've got a number. I mean, I can identify what installations have those RIs at. I just can't, I can only tell you my states that I'm responsible for right now.
Is there a list out there? Like, it's surprisingly hard to track down this information for a citizen, right? So where would we go to find that?
I'll have to, if you can send me an email, I can get you the list of the sites. But I don't think it's publicly posted out there
Okay.
where the bases are at. But
And what is your email address?
it's at the end of the presentation as well as the
Okay.
beginning of it. We'll get to it when I get to the end of the RI presentation.
Okay. All right.
Does that answer your question, hopefully?
Well, not all
To a
of it.
point, not everything, but.
And Bill, I guess I'd like to highlight just the significance of, you know, being in the top 12 out of 75 installations, and then our contract includes 3 installations, and we're being done first out of those 3. And I think that's very reflective of the priority given by the local National Guard leadership and our state leadership, and NGB recognizing the concerns of the community and addressing this by prioritizing Truax Field over many other installations. So thank you for that and getting this process started here at Truax.
Okay. Over here.
Yeah, you mentioned the spring data collection. As you start that data collection, are you planning to share those findings in real time, or what does that information sharing look like?
Well, so when I get into this, it's going to be an iterative process. There's potentially 3 phases to the remedial investigation. And I'll kind of go through each one of those, kind of show you, talk about how we're going to do it a little bit, kind of give you an overview. And it's an iterative process. So we've got this conceptual site model where we think we know, here's what we know and here's what we don't know. So we're going to try to collect the information that we don't know to kind of connect the dots. Where is there a connection between surface water and groundwater? Is there how deep is the slope? Those types of things that we don't know. And so when we go out for the first phase, we're going to try to do our best to delineate all those different media to the best that we can. Then we're going to come back, we're going to look at the data, and then, oh shoot, we still don't know. We didn't define, the groundwater plume goes further. We're not at the end of the tail of the plume, or we don't have the width of the plume defined. We need to get more monitoring wells or more information. So then, if that's the case, we'll go back out and we'll work with the DNR and identify what those data gaps are, and then we'll go collect that information. And then if we still don't have it, we're going to go out again until we actually have it, so we can actually write the remedial investigation report to move on to the next stages of the CERCLA process. So does that make sense?
Yeah, thanks for that background. Before the report is finalized, though, what's the process for sharing with the public? That sounded very informal.
So funny you asked that. So right now, we're doing this open house because we're working on trying to get a contract put together that will do a community involvement plan for Truax, which will go out and they'll do a census of the public, the community, how they want to be talked to, how they want to be communicated with. And part of that, there's a restoration advisory board assessment that they do. So they ask the community, is there any interest in doing a restoration advisory board? And my sites, I've probably got about 4 of them that I have actively going on in Pennsylvania, New York, and potentially here. But I know the 115th Fighter Wing wants to do a restoration advisory board. We just have to get the contract in place to do that. So we're doing this open house to help facilitate communicating this information out to y'all. So ideally, they would get the community involvement plan in place, and then the restoration advisory board, they'll work with the 115th Fighter Wing to get that restoration advisory board in gear. They work with the community to select members, a co-chair, they get involved, and then they would host like quarterly meetings to get updates on what we're doing out here. So that's how we typically communicate those things. And working with the DNR, they would be working with us on those meetings and that. We'd give updates and presentations. We don't have the contract in place to get there yet, but they're working on that for this year. So at some point, there's going to be a restoration advisory board where we do these meetings and we communicate with the public and share the data. here's what we found during our first phase, and give an update. And just like what we're going to do, we're just giving you an overview of the process because we haven't started it. But when we do that, we'll definitely want to reach out to communicate with y'all what we're finding and where we're going and what the next steps are.
Any timeline on that involvement plan, estimated timeline?
It should be this fiscal year, so we just got our budget approved. So.
Thank you.
Yep. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
When you talk about these international guard bases, and you talk about competing for this funding, is the funding for the International Guard pollution sites segregated somehow from the rest of the military sites?
No, we compete the Air Force, within the Air Force DIRT program, which is Defense Environmental Restoration Program. It's Air Force there's Air National Guard, there's Air Force Reserve, and there's active duty. And these RRSCs that we put together, it's ranked amongst that whole entire portfolio, and they look at worst first.
There are currently at least 678 military installations across the country that have a PFAS problem. Those are Air Force and Navy, probably Air National Guard. So you're making it sound really good when you mentioned that there's just a couple of dozen or something. So you're competing against all those 678.
No, we're competing against the sites in the Air Force portfolio. They program and budget for Air Force, and we're one of 3 components in the Air Force. Army does the same thing. There's Army National Guard, Army Reserve, I think Army Material Command. There's 4 within the Army. The Navy has its own line of accounting for DIRT, and they have their priorities and budgets. So DoD approves that overall budget for the components. So that they're not, we don't have I guess the Air Force has its own DIRT funding, but we manage the portfolio and what the priorities are through the Air Force headquarters and the Secretariat. Okay? Back there. You got a question?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm trying to figure out how to phrase it. So, a few slides ago, you had the process, and I know you're going to get to the rest of the process
Yeah.
down the line. But I noticed the last 2, the estimated timeline was 1 to 30 plus years. And I'm thinking about, you're competing for funding now.
No, well, we're not competing because it's under contract.
Right,
So.
okay, but you just were. You're going to have to compete for the next phases of the project, right? Because that's the reason it can get held up.
Yep.
Yep. And so I'm wondering about, even when this is all said and done, you finally get to remediation, what kind of ongoing work will you be required to do? And how much, is that just perpetual funding that you need to infinity, or?
No, what we do is on the programming process, I mean, the Air Force, when they look at the Air Force portfolio, they look at how many sites in the Air Force need RIs, and there's a number out there. There's X amount that need RIs.
Sure.
And I'll give you for this fiscal year, FY22. So in FY22, the Air Force has a plan. Hey, we're going to do X amount of RIs we're going to fund. They put together a spend plan that identifies what they're going to fund at different phases and they identify that. So that's how they look at everything and how they're going to, with the money that they're allocated, they program and plan with that. Now things change, obviously. No plan's perfect. It doesn't survive contact. There's things that change. But every fiscal year they identify what phases are required, and then they try to program and budget for those. And if they don't get them this fiscal year, they'll get them next year. So it just bumps to the next fiscal year until it gets funded.
I guess if we're asking, what kind of ongoing continual remediation work will you need to do after the actual remediation is over, right? To take care of the site?
Well, I mean, there's long-term monitoring you can do. I mean, if there's residual contamination, it depends on what the remediation is, and we don't know what that is right now because we don't have the problem defined.
That's why 1 to 60 years on the time.
Right, yeah. Some go quicker, some take longer. It all depends on how complex the site is and how well we have it delineated and what the available technologies are there. Technology is also another thing. PFAS, no one, it's an emerging contaminant. 10 years ago, how do you treat PFAS? I don't know, I never even heard of it. But now, because it's an emerging contaminant, we're trying to come up with emerging technologies as well to keep up with that. So there might be some technology that comes up, and like what they were talking, Lieutenant Colonel Satz was talking about, they're doing a pilot test that's looking at something that treats groundwater at the Truax, just a kind of contractor came out and wanted to do a pilot on it, and the Air Guard paid for it, and so you want to add any more to that?
Well, yeah, I just wanted to add, it sounds like a lot of installations, and it is certainly a significant issue across DOD and across really all airports, FAA certified airports that are required to use firefighting foam. But to date, DOD has invested more than $1.5 billion, and sorry, that's billion with a B, in PFAS-related research and cleanup. So, and the DERT funding process isn't new to PFAS. This is a process that's been used for contaminants over over decades. So it's not a new process of how to fund projects and address possible impacts to the community. It's a tried and true process that luckily our sites here have been included in the DERT funding process to compete for those federal funds, along with things that the National Guard Bureau has already done to use some of their own funding as well to fill out any type of gaps in between what it may have been provided from Big Air Force or the DERT funding process as well to address. So a lot of the questions I think we're answering right now have to do with the RI.
Right.
So maybe we should get through the RI slideshow, unless there's any specific RRSE. And again, I'm not here to try to cut off any questions. We're here to answer your questions. I think some of them might be covered in the presentation.
They will be. So yeah, if there's no relative risk site evaluation questions, it's right now we're a little bit behind, but I'll jump into the RI presentation. A lot of this we've talked about, and then we can open it back up for questions again. So on here, PFAS remedial investigation, federal response. Talked about CERCLA, that's the regulation that we're working under. DOD conducts environmental restoration in accordance with CERCLA. And the cleanup, we also use the Defense Environmental Restoration Program. There's a guidance out there from DOD on how to do restoration activities. And then Air Force and Air National Guard has their own internal policies related to this as well. So the environmental restoration process, we've already talked about the timeline. This is more of just another general overview. I'll move on to the next slide. Already looked at this slide, it talks about the different components of the CERCLA process and how many years it may take to do each one of them. And where we are in the PFAS investigation process, we're starting the RI. We completed the PA back in August of 2015, and then also did the site inspection. It was November 2017. So now we're starting the RI, and we're looking at doing field work in the spring of 22. I talked about the documents and stuff that we've sent to DNR to review. The UFP-QAP, which is the Quality Assurance Project Plan, that basically lays out the sampling methodology, how we're going to do it, the analysis that we're going to do, and that whole process, where we're going to do it at. There's two of them. There was a programmatic one that covered 3 different bases that we started earlier last spring, and there's a site-specific one for Truax, which DNR has already provided us comments on, and we're responding to get ready to finalize that to support what we're going to do this spring. So also mentioned, it was under contract 30 September 2020. So it's been under contract for a year plus, and tentatively scheduled to, if everything goes right, if we don't have to go through all 3 phases, we could get the report earlier. But right now, we're assuming that we're going to have to do 3 different phases of this to get the answers that we need. Data drives where we go or where we don't go. So I'm going to move on to the next slide. These are the components of the investigation. So at the top, we look at 10 potential release areas. There's also a 1993 F-16 crash site. We want to delineate the sources at these areas where the releases happen. We want to know how deep, how wide, what the concentrations are, what's the highest, what's the lowest, how's that impacting the groundwater, is it leachable to the groundwater, and then once it's in the groundwater, we'll do the second bullet shows the different environmental sampling that we'll do. So we'll be doing sampling with soil, groundwater, surface water, sediment, using lysometers to measure surface water infiltration. And then there's also this high-resolution site characterization process. We have a slide on that. We'll show you a little bit more detail. Permanent groundwater monitoring wells. One of the unique features that we're going to be doing is we're going to have an on-site laboratory to provide real-time sampling results. So when we're characterizing soil and groundwater, the lab's going to be able to analyze those samples, and we'll know a day later after we collected them. So that's going to help us do this rapid characterization of what's out there to help support delineating the sources. Also mentioned earlier that this is a multi-step process. It's iterative. So right now, DNR's been given the quality assurance project plan and looked at it. They concur with our approach. We've identified how we're going to delineate soil, groundwater, all that, and where. And they know it's going to be an iterative process. So right now we're on board. This spring we'll come out, and I think the first part of it will look at delineating groundwater using a direct push rig, collecting groundwater samples, as well as collecting some soil and surface water samples and sediment. And so go to the next bullet up at the top. So conceptual site model. I want to talk a little bit more about this. This is what really defines what's going on at the site. So it's first developed during the PASI. We kind of got an idea of, yes, there's groundwater contamination. We know that there's soil contamination. So now, some of the data that we want to collect is, where the data gaps are, where we don't have information. So how far does groundwater go? How fast is groundwater flowing? What are the concentrations? How far does it go on base? Does it go off base? Does it interact with a surface water body? All those things, there's a lot of data gaps that we have that we're going to try to answer. And then, we've already kind of identified the likely sources of PFAS through the PASI. Then we'll talk about migration pathways, which I already kind of talked a little bit about. And then talk about, identifying receptors, human and wildlife. And then the final CSM will allow for a risk assessment based upon the exposure model. So basically, the RI data that we collect is going to help us do a baseline environmental risk assessment for human health out here. So all that data kind of feeds into that, but we can't do that risk assessment until we collect all the data that we need to properly do that assessment. So next slide. So this is kind of just a general overview of the Truax. These are our PRL sites up here. Down here is the former City of Madison landfill, Reynolds property, former wastewater treatment. Over here is where the crash site was. Just kind of a general overview of the 115th Fire Wing. And then the next slide is a little bit blown up, zoomed in a little bit more to kind of give you a better idea. And then across, this is the West Firefighter Training Area. And then there's also a Pearson Street East Firefighting Training Area down here. So just to kind of give you an example, this is what a direct push looks like. It basically takes a rod, pushes a acetate sleeve that's probably can be anywhere from 18 inches to 24 inches long. They go down, they can collect a sample. I think what EA is going to be using is they got a probe that measures hydrostatic pressure, to delineate the different zones of where groundwater is, and then based upon that, they'll identify water-bearing zones and then collect groundwater samples from those and analyze it. So we're going to be looking, using this direct push, we're going to be able to look at lateral extent. So if the surface water is 5 feet below the ground surface, we're going to be able to collect groundwater samples and collect samples until we don't see any PFAS contamination at depth. So when we do this phased approach to this, when they do this delineation using the direct push, once we think that we got the footprint of the groundwater plume defined, the next phase would be to come in and put in permanent monitoring wells to basically match the plume footprint, so we can collect real data from a monitoring well out there. And then the high resolution site characterization, and the next slide I think talks about that. But from this, by doing this kind of drilling and that's going to give us an idea of where the soils, what the different soil types are at depth below the ground surface, where the water is, what the water quality is at depth, and then also just the different geology that we're going to experience. And so this is just a kind of an overview of the high resolution site characterization. A lot of this we'll use transects where we'll go on a line. We know that the source area is, let's say, in the middle, and we'll step out to the left and to the right on a transect and go down and collect groundwater and soil data until we know that we've got it defined. Hey, there's no more PFAS over here. Then we'll move on to the next transect to try to get a better definition of that. But collecting that kind of information kind of gives us a three-dimensional view of what the plume looks like below the ground surface. Can't do that with just 1 or 2 data points. You have to do it with multiple data points. So that's where we get this high resolution site characterization process from, collecting all that multiple groundwater data and soil data to better define what the plume looks like below the subsurface. And here's just an example of surface water sediment sampling. Off to the left, they're collecting a sediment sample from the stream bed. Over here, they're collecting a surface water sample from a creek. We use these to help, assess the extent of transport of PFAS away from the base, if there is any. And then groundwater monitoring wells. Here we have a drill rig. This is what they use to drill a hole in the ground, and we can, based upon where we know that the groundwater contamination was, how deep it was, we'll put monitoring wells that basically straddle the water table to make sure we collect groundwater quality from there. And if there's a vertical component where the PFAS contamination goes down, 10 feet, 20 feet, 30 feet, we'll also put in permanent monitoring wells that evaluates that groundwater quality from that same depth where we return it where the bottom of the plume was. So we got real monitoring wells that we can go back and continue to sample to support future activities out there. And then it provides additional lithologic and geologic data. Okay, now we're to questions. So, any more questions on the RI? I'm sure you do. So.
If I could just,
yep, go ahead.
if I could just add to.
You have to use your command voice.
Got to use there we go.
There you go.
If I could just add to, and touching upon the construction, I know you had that question earlier. So as you saw all those different data points that we're looking to capture through the remedial investigation, all the different construction activities, we've been able to leverage design funds to gather more data points to supplement this study. So there's been over $500,000 in design funds that have been used to do an additional over 100 samples. That information has been provided to EA, and that's just from Truax Field, the 115 Fighter Wing. Our partners as well have done different samplings at Dane County Regional Airport, the City of Madison, the DNR. All their information that has been captured is being fed to this study so that the remedial investigation, as Bill had said, can follow the data. So it'll give them a path, it'll give them information to go out and validate as they follow any type of impacts that may be the source may be the Wisconsin Air National Guard. So yeah, the construction activities, as we talked, not only the sampling is that benefit, we're able to also mitigate sites as we address construction at each site. So it's another way that we're able to kind of leverage different funds and different approaches with the RI and working with the federal government on one of those, but also with the federal government on a construction site. You have to remediate or mitigate any type of impacts, any type of environmental impacts you run into that site. So it's provided us that opportunity to lean forward as well and do a site-by-site work as well in coordination with the DNR and our material management plans.
Okay. Question? All right. Gentleman in the back, and I'll get to you down in the front here. Go ahead.
How many
Sorry.
PFAS are you looking at? Are you just looking at PFOS and PFOA, or any?
When they do the analysis, there's multiple compounds in the PFAS and the analytical method. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah.
Yeah, they look at multiple different PFAS components, all the daughter products and that. All right.
Yeah,
Stay away from this.
I understand it's a class of over 5,000 chemicals. Within that,
There's a defined number that the EPA Analytical Method, and that's what we're using. We're not going above and beyond that. So EPA has identified an analytical method that identifies, what's the method? Does anyone know offhand?
It's QSM 5.4.
Go ahead and talk in the mic.
Okay, so the method that, the EPA method is a 537.1, which is for finished drinking water. And there's another method that was recently developed, which is also for finished drinking water, which is 533. But we're not looking at finished drinking water because the samples aren't as clean. There's some turbidity issues, so the government has additional quality standards, the DoD manual QSM 5. I believe it's version 5.4, which table B15 and lists additional requirements on terms of how to clean up the sample, how to do extraction, how to look at various tagging of isotopes, things like that, in order to eliminate matrix interference in the analytical. To answer your question, there are, depending on the lab, I mean, typically they're looking at, around 28 PFAS. The method 537 started out with 14 individual PFAS. The mobile lab is using the same exact instrumentation that they use in the fixed lab, but they're using it in a screening mode. That means they can still see down a part per trillion, and they can do 30 samples a day, which is quite a number of samples, and we can see that result the next day. So what they do to get that throughput is they'll be looking at surrogates. They'll be looking at PFOA, PFOS, and PFBS, which are, I would say, the three most important ones with respect to DoD in terms of their site investigations. But they're good surrogates. They're typically the ones that you find most common at DoD sites. So we get a pretty good handle on that in real time, and we can look at that in 3 dimensions. Then we go back, put the wells in, and establish temporal trends over time using the validated laboratory fixed data, because that's what you want to use when you're characterizing risk or doing any type of groundwater modeling. You want to use the data from the monitoring wells. But just one last thing, monitoring wells are for monitoring. They're not for delineating the plume. So this high resolution characterization is a really powerful tool that's been kind of reinvigorated for the PFAS investigations, because there really isn't a good screening technology that you can take an instrument out and hold it in your hand and sniff it. So you have to bring a lab out. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you.
Yep. Okay, down front. You got a question?
What's the budget for this investigation phase?
What's that?
What's the cost for the investigation phase?
I want to say for this right now, I think just under 2 million, I believe. Am I right in the right range?
Yeah, locally, the National Guard overall has spent over $2 million locally for Truax Field from the PA up through where we are.
Oh, it's more than that. That's just the RI I'm talking about. The PA and that's a whole other cost separate. So the RI is over 2 million-ish, plus or minus.
Plus the 4?
No, I'd say around 2 million-ish. I mean, what was the cost?
I'm just, are you talking about something different than he's talking about?
The PASI, the preliminary assessment and the site inspection, that's not, I'm talking about what we put on contract for 30 September 2020. So the cost for the PASI is a whole additional cost. And I don't know what the specific dollar amount was for that, but we can get that. I mean,
Yeah, we'll get you that information. Just want to make sure that our numbers are squared up.
Yep. Okay. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah, so, so this gets sort of what you were saying, to the military officer here. So during the main construction projects which have already begun, what steps are the Air National Guard taking to identify and properly address PFAS contaminated water and soil contamination encountered? And could you please provide some details?
Yeah, again, the construction that we have ongoing at the installation and from year to year,
There's continuous construction here. So what are you doing to identify and address the PFAS contamination of the water and the soil? What are you doing to clean it up?
So we've been able to use these construction projects to sample and identify, and then we work directly with the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources on a material management plan for each specific site. All the information on those material management plans and the ratings that we have from each one of those sites is available on their BERT's website. You can find that information there. But at each one of our construction sites, which isn't unique to Truax Field, this is a normal process for construction in general, with dealing any type of possible contaminant, is having a material management plan that is agreeable to our regulator on how do we address or mitigate any type of possible risks for that site. So we work with the DNR and have approved material management plans for our construction sites, and again, that's provided a lot of opportunity for us to mitigate at each individual site as we work around our installation.
Okay. Yes, ma'am.
I'm starting to wonder about the dangers to the employees at the Dane County Airport and at Truax Field for their exposure to these toxins that are being stirred up from the construction happening in both places. And is there any kind of education program or protection program for those people that are working there every day?
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe they have health and safety plans when they're excavating and dealing with the materials. So they tell them, you're not supposed to be touching the soil if they know that it's contaminated. And that's why they go ahead before that and delineate where they know where the contaminated soil is. So if they're going to excavate contaminated soil, the contractor knows, hey, here's an area. This is how you got to handle this and manage it. So they're aware. There's a health and safety plans, even just for general construction, with the power tools and electrical. But they also have that related to if they're working with hazardous, the contaminated
That's
soil.
communicated to the employees at Dane County Airport and.
Well, they're not working on the construction projects.
Right, so we're speaking specifically to the construction projects, and any of those possible hazards are dealt with each construction company that may be there, but the human contact hazard, my understanding is fairly minimal. I mean, of what we're dealing with at each site and how we address any type of possible PFAS impacts at that site. As far as just the general population, my understanding there's not a hazard to the general population of the installation that is not present at the construction site. So I don't believe that is a concern. We've worked with the...
When you reference the Dane County Regional Airport and our staff as well, I just want to clarify that the project that you see underway is being done by a contractor who has been mentioned, has safety plans. We only have about 1 and sometimes 2 employees that are ever around that actual construction site. And those employees are engineers and ones who are educated and knowledgeable about the risks and the safety programs that they have to follow.
And there's been some discussion of concerns of there being further contamination by doing construction. And working with the Wisconsin DNR, we've come to an agreement that with us following material management plans, that there is very minimal risk that actual performing the construction is causing the current PFAS impacts to migrate. The surface is not exposed for a very long period of time, and really the chances of that amplifying per se PFAS migration has been assessed as extremely low.
Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so what is being done now to slow the continuous flow of PFAS off the property? For example, you mentioned the stormwater management program. Where can we get more information about that or any other ongoing things that you're doing right now to slow the flow of PFAS off the property?
So I would say there's two primary resources. The airport website, which that is msnairport.com, has a comprehensive PFAS page that has a lot of information on it and a lot of resources. Also, the other site would be the BIRD site, where we continually update that as well.
What site is that?
That is the DNR's website. And we can provide you with, links to that. There are links on the airport's website. If you go to that PFAS page on the airport's website, you'll find links to just about any place you could possibly think of to get information.
If you're not familiar with BIRD's Bureau of Remediation, yeah.
We call it BIRD. It stands for Bureau of Remediation Redevelopment Tracking System. And within our remediation redevelopment program, over the last roughly 5 years, we've had a pretty extensive effort to try to make all of our records electronic. So about 3 years ago, we changed our rules to require an actual electronic submittal. But we've been at this for 25 years, so we are also in the process of trying to take all of our old paper records and have them scanned. So if you, the place to really start, if you do a Google search on what's called RRSE map, you can get a map of the entire state. And all of our sites, both open and closed, are there. You can then zero in to get to a point where you can identify an actual site. And then if you click on that, it will give you this tracking number. And then you can open our actual tracking system to look at what's there. So we have information about all of our open sites and some subset of our closed sites there. All of our closed sites are going to be listed, but if there's, where this has really been useful is like somebody doing a site assessment because a real estate company wants to buy a property with a gas station. So they can now go to this electronic website rather than coming to the DNR and actually looking that up. So by going to our sites map, I've been to the Dane County site a few times. We actually have a number of sites that are listed for Dane County. So the most relevant ones are going to be the one that is mentioned is the 115th Fighter Wing, the one that is mentioned as, the second one. We have one, Dane County Airport. So those are the two that are going to have most of the work. But we also do have another one on F-35 construction. So you can see all of those various documents. It is kind of a hassle when you have a large property with multiple numbers, but we did try to make an attempt to keep the files as clear as possible for people to go look those up.
Yeah, as we work towards our community involvement plan, we're fortunate to have that capability through the Wisconsin DNR to have a public a site that is standardized for sharing this type of information. So a lot of questions about where our reports are and where the data is, we just ask to go to the DNR's website. We submit all that information to them and it's publicly available like any other type of emerging contaminant that may be out there at our site in Wisconsin.
Okay, another question in the back row.
Yes, on the back row. if you go to BERTS and you look up the stormwater treatment system results, they say that the results of the field pilot study have been highly variable PFAS removal rates. Typical PFOS removal was reported to be around 18%, and typical PFOA removal was reported to be around 4%. At the end of July, the state of Michigan did a webinar on treating stormwater contaminated with PFAS, and they did not invite a presenter with a biology degree whose corporate website claims the ability to deal with bad smells at sewage treatment plants. They invited Brandon Steets of Geosyntec, who is a chemical engineer, who is trained to design processes to separate chemicals. He made a statement during his webinar that I think points directly at the system. Many stormwater vendor media filters provide marginal contact time, suggesting low, if any, effectiveness for PFAS. So I have two questions. If attempts to limit infiltration in the sewer system do not produce large reductions, will EA evaluate the possibility of treating only the contaminated water instead of treating it at an outfall that handles runoff from a very large area? And two, will it assign or contract a chemical engineer like Brandon Steets to design a stormwater treatment system according to widely accepted engineering principles?
Okay, I'll take that. So with respect to, there was two parts of your question. One about stormwater treatment, right? And then the other one was, can you tell me what the first part of it was?
In reading the site investigation plan, I see that EA is planning to sample upstream in the sewer network to pinpoint the source of the contamination.
Right, we're going to try to delineate the conceptual site model where our data gaps are. If is the sewer system or stormwater contributing to groundwater contamination or those different sources.
So that affords an opportunity to capture the water close to the source where it has the highest concentrations, instead of waiting until it reaches the outfall where it's mixed in with a lot of rainwater from a large area.
Right.
And then the second question is, are they going to contract or provide someone who's actually trained to do a chemical separation process instead of biologists who treat sewage smells?
Okay, so the first part of your question, yes, we're going to evaluate storm, sanitary sewers as potential sources, and if our source areas are contributing to those, so that's the RI, will delineate that and say this, there's a connection, or no, there's not. There's also other sources of contamination out there. It's not just the 115th. There's other sources off-site. So we look at all those different things, and we'll look at that pathway to see if there's a completion. And then the RI will document, okay, yes, there's a completed pathway. We see that the soil contamination and groundwater contamination from X site is contributing to this. And so when we go to the actual proposed plan, the feasibility study and the proposed plan to make a decision on cleanup, then they'll select that technology. With respect to surface water treatment, two of my sites, one in Pennsylvania, I have one, and one at Stewart Air National Guard Base. They're doing surface water treatment out there. That's part of the NEPDS permit requirement, not so much the cleanup, but they do hire, we have professional engineers that sign off on, they develop the plans and specs for these systems to ensure that they comply with the discharge requirements. So if there was any type of treatment system, let's say for our proposed remedy, we're going to comply, with the discharge limits that's required by the DNR. So they got any PDS discharge limits, and whatever they come up with when they get promulgated rules, we'll comply with what we need to do to discharge that, whether if we're discharging it back into a sanitary sewer system, or if we actually have to get an NEPDS permit to discharge our, because with remediation, you got multiple options when you treat groundwater. We're not at the treating groundwater or surface water stage yet, because we're still doing the RI. But I can guarantee you that it's not going to be a biologist that's designing our surface water treatment system if we have to do one.
That's very good to hear.
Okay. Yeah, I think probably a good time for me to bring up Orin Technologies, because I think you talked a little bit about addressing it at the source versus waiting for it to work its way into other stormwaters. And with that, this again, just to clarify, the remedial investigation and the path that Bill is talking about is what's happening for the federal government of working through the circle process. Locally, in a partnership between Dane County Regional Airport, or Dane County, and the 115th Fighter Wing and Department of Military Affairs, we're working with Orin Technologies, a local company out of Verona, that has some science and technologies that they have worked that we have authorized through a pilot study that actually the DNR has authorized and approved through a pilot study that's showing some very successful results. We're addressing it right at one of our source sites, our probable release location number 2 that's near our fire department on the installation, to try to address it right at one of the sources there before it mitigates off property and mixes with other waters. So again, a local company that has been doing some great work, and that we, again, locally, your local government and your local agencies are doing what they can as well on top of the federal effort to address any immediate concerns of the community. And really, you know, as we talk about the whole of government approach, I think what we're doing here at Truax at Dane County Regional Airport is a model of the whole of government approach of using federal, state, your county, your city, and also industry through Orin Technologies to address this issue. So we're looking at addressing it and not just looking at a one-pronged approach of the federal government, but looking at strategies here locally as well of what we can do to address the community's concern and any PFAS impacts.
All right. Yep, go ahead.
Is the military going to help members of our community who feed their families with the fish? And, you know, now that's a problem. So is there something that you folks could do for those families dependent on the fish that they get out? They have, you know, they didn't know until now that it's not good for them. So is there something you can do about that?
So I guess I'll touch upon, again, the whole of government approach. There's different areas that the federal government addresses. There's different areas that are best addressed by the county, the city, by the state. With that, if there's anyone from the city or from the DNR would like to kind of speak to what they're doing relating to any type of impact to wildlife in Starkweather Creek, I think is what you're addressing.
I think the only thing I can speak to is that the Department of Natural Resources issued a fish consumption advisory. The data indicate there's certain fish that we have put out a recommendation on limiting your consumption on either a weekly or monthly basis. I don't recall what those are at the moment, but that's readily available. My understanding, I haven't walked it in a while, but my understanding is that Public Health Madison, Dane County put some signs up along the creek, and then I think most of the boat landings on Lake Monona also have a similar sign. So from that standpoint, that's at least what the DNR has done is issued a fish consumption advisory. Whether people choose to follow it is up to them. But the DNR has put this out in our, I think it's called Choosing Wisely pamphlet, which covers fish consumption advisories around the state. And then a local, again, I haven't walked the creek in a while, but my understanding it was posted. I think those signs are still at the boat landing, but I'm not certain.
I can speak for the city briefly that we used some of our federal COVID relief funds, recognizing that subsistence fishing may be higher now, particularly because of the economic conditions of the pandemic, to work with our public health department to conduct some outreach for people who are fishing for subsistence purposes and identify other ways we might be able to connect them to protein sources and meet their needs and better understand. Maybe we can better make sure the information is out there and identify ways we can be of more assistance. So that work is starting, ongoing. I don't know if there's, but it is something that we're making an effort at.
Well, I would like to conclude this question and answer session, and if we want to go out to the poster boards and we want to talk one-on-one, definitely like to do that. So point of contact information up here for the 115th Fighter Wing, as well as myself, sir, if you have any.
So Captain Westmont, thank you for helping us, with tonight's venue, and certainly Madison Area Technical College, thanks for hosting this event tonight, open to the community. With that, this session has been recorded and will be posted. As Captain Westmont had mentioned, her email address is up there if you would like to take a photo of that to ask her any questions that may not have been answered here that we don't address when we're out in the public speaking forum. And again, just want to thank our state leadership of recognizing the community concerns and these impacts to the community, and helping prioritize and send that message out to National Guard Bureau and to our federal entities. And thanks for getting this prioritized. Those that have been involved with the circle process know that the remedial investigation is a very significant step to get to address any possible impacts. And we're grateful to be at that step and to be moving forward here locally to address the concerns and address the situation.
From the Dane County Airport position as well, I'd like to thank the Guard for taking the initiative to move forward with the RI as quickly as they did. That really is a huge step forward for our community. May not seem like it, but when you talk about 12 out of 75, and we're one of the first 3 that have been awarded the contract, that's a really key factor for us. We also have a really good partnership with them, as mentioned, with the Orem Technologies pilot project and some of our stormwater infrastructure process. It's really a great situation that we have here, that we're able to work with them and partner to move these things forward more quickly than either of us could on our own. So thank you.
All right. That concludes our presentation. We'll be out by the poster boards to talk with y'all some more if you want. And thank you for patience, and looking forward to moving forward on the RI, getting some data. Thank you.